There is a message sitting in my drafts folder right now. It's been there for 6 years. I wrote it, I never sent it, and last month, I finally read it again for the first time since I wrote it. What it said changed the way I think about every single decision I've made since. I'm going to tell you exactly what was in that message. But first, you need to understand who I was when I wrote it, because if you're honest with yourself, you might realize you're writing the same message right now, in your own head, and you don't even know it. 6 years ago, I was standing in a parking lot outside a job I hated, typing a text message to my best friend. It said something like, "I think I'm going to quit and try the thing I actually want to do." My thumb was literally hovering over send. And then I didn't send it. I didn't send it because a voice in my head, very calm, very reasonable sounding, said, "Not yet. Wait until you're more ready. Wait until it's safer." You know that voice. Everyone knows that voice. It doesn't yell at you. It doesn't sound like fear. It sounds like wisdom. It sounds like the responsible adult in the room. That's what makes it so dangerous. It never announces itself as fear. It disguises itself as patience. So I didn't send the text. I opened a blank note instead, and I wrote out everything I was actually feeling, the whole plan, the whole fear, the whole, here's what I would do if I weren't scared. I wrote 3 paragraphs. And then I saved it as a draft and closed the laptop, telling myself I'd come back to it, when the time was right. If you've ever done that, written down the honest version of what you want, and then quietly closed the document instead of acting on it, you already know where this is going. 6 years passed. Not because I was lazy. Not because I didn't care. Life just filled in around the decision. Bills. Comfort. A promotion that made the job slightly more bearable, just enough to keep me there. There's a particular kind of quiet that happens right after you finally act on something you've been avoiding for a long time. It's not triumphant, usually. It's not the movie moment. It's much smaller than that, a strange, settled stillness, like a room where a noise you'd gotten so used to hearing has just stopped, and the silence itself is what makes you realize how loud it had actually been the entire time. That's what sending the message felt like. Not a fireworks moment. Just quiet, for the first time in 6 years, in a part of my head that had been quietly running that background tab the whole time without me fully noticing. That's what's waiting for you on the other side of your draft too. Not necessarily a dramatic new life. Maybe just quiet, in a place that's been a little too loud for a little too long. So here's what I actually want from you before you go. Scroll down, and in the comments, finish this sentence, my draft says. One sentence. Doesn't have to be polished. Doesn't have to make sense to anyone else. I read every single one, and I promise you, whatever you write, someone else scrolling through these comments is going to read it and realize they've been sitting on the exact same draft. And if this video is the thing that finally got you to open yours, hit subscribe, because I'm going to keep making these, and there's a good chance the next one is the exact push you need for the next draft after this one. There's always a next one. That's not a bad thing. That's just what growing looks like. The message is already written. It's sitting in your drafts folder right now, in one form or another. The only question left is whether you send it today, or whether you let it sit there for another 6 years, waiting for a version of ready that was never actually coming. That's the version of you that's waiting on the other side of your own draft, whatever it says. Not a stranger. Not a risk. Someone you already, quietly, trust, you've just never formally met. If there's one thing I'd want you to leave this video with, it's this: the version of you that already knows what they want is not somewhere in the future, waiting for more information. He's already written the draft. She's already said the sentence out loud in her head 100 times. That person already exists, right now, today, not as someone you'll become eventually, but as someone you're actively choosing not to listen to, one quiet day at a time. You don't need 6 years to figure out what I figured out in that parking lot. You already know what your draft says. You knew before you started watching this video. You're just deciding, right now, in real time, whether today is the day you finally read it back to yourself honestly, or whether you close the laptop one more time and call it patience. Both are choices. Only one of them costs you a version of yourself you'll never get to meet. I think about Farid sometimes, and how young he was to already understand something that took me until my 30s and took the man in the waiting room until his 70s. It makes me wonder how much of this isn't really about age or experience at all. Maybe the draft has always been readable. Maybe the only thing that changes over the years isn't the clarity of the message, it's how many more years you're willing to let pass before you finally admit you could read it the whole time. I finally sent that message. 6 years late, to the same friend, who, for the record, had absolutely no memory of the original conversation and had to ask what I was talking about. Which, honestly, made the whole thing feel a little less dramatic and a little more true to life. Nobody was waiting on the edge of their seat for my decision. Nobody had been keeping score except me. That's usually how it goes. We treat our big decisions like they're being watched, judged, remembered by an audience that is, in reality, almost entirely made up of people who are far too busy managing their own unsent drafts to notice ours. I think that's actually one of the more freeing realizations buried in all of this. We delay so many decisions because we imagine an audience, people cataloging our choices, ready to judge the failures and remember the missteps. But most people are living the exact same interior story you are. They're standing in their own hallway, rereading their own draft, wondering if anyone's watching them closely enough to notice if they finally walk through the door. Nobody's watching as closely as you think. Which means the fear of being judged for trying is, in most cases, a fear of an audience that barely exists. After I sent the message, I did something I hadn't planned on doing. I went back and reread the whole draft one more time, start to finish, out loud, alone in my apartment, which felt a little ridiculous even as I was doing it. I wanted to hear what 28-year-old me actually sounded like. And what struck me wasn't the plan, or the fear, or even the honesty about calling fear, timing. What struck me was how much he already trusted the version of himself he was scared to become. He wasn't writing to talk himself out of it. He was writing the way you write to someone you already believe in, but haven't quite worked up the nerve to introduce to the rest of your life yet. It's that they keep coming back to the draft anyway, again and again, until one of those times finally sticks. I want to bring you back to that parking lot for a second. Because I still remember exactly what it felt like to close that laptop and tell myself later. It didn't feel like defeat. That's the trick of it, it never feels like defeat in the moment. It feels like patience. It feels responsible. It only becomes defeat in hindsight, usually years later, usually on an ordinary day that has nothing to do with anything. So here's what the draft said. Word for word, as close as I can recall it, because I've read it enough times now that it's basically memorized. It said, I don't actually think I'll fail if I try this. I think I'm scared of succeeding at something that was entirely my own idea, because then there's no one else to credit and no one else to blame. I want to do this. I am not going to send this message tonight because I'm scared, and I'm calling that timing. 28-year-old me, in a parking lot, already knew exactly what was happening. He named the fear precisely, accurately, and then filed it away under something that sounded more respectable. That's the part that actually changed something in me when I reread it. Not the plan itself, the plan was fine, nothing revolutionary. It was the honesty. Younger me wasn't confused. He wasn't lost. He knew precisely what he wanted and precisely why he wasn't doing it, and he wrote both of those things down in the same 3 paragraphs, side by side, without even seeming to notice the contradiction. I think that's true for most of us, most of the time. We're not actually as lost as we claim to be. Somewhere in there, we already know. The confusion is often just the fear wearing a more socially acceptable outfit. 6th, build your own hallway, on purpose, instead of waiting to be pushed into one. Remember Elena's weekends at the farmer's market. You don't need to blow up your current life to test the next one. If it's a business, sell one version of it on the side before you quit anything. If it's a relationship conversation, have a smaller, lower stakes version of it first, with someone else, just to hear what the words sound like out loud. If it's a creative pursuit, publish the small, embarrassing, imperfect version before you're ready to publish the polished one. The hallway isn't something that happens to you. You can build it yourself, and you can make it as short as you're willing to make it. 7th, expect the anticlimax, and don't let it fool you into thinking the decision didn't matter. Remember that my friend didn't even remember the original conversation when I finally sent that message 6 years later. That's going to happen to you too, in some form. The moment you finally act, the world is very unlikely to respond with the dramatic significance you've been building up in your head for months or years. People will be mildly interested, at best, and then move on with their day. Don't mistake that quiet reception for proof that the decision was small. The decision was never really about how the world would react. It was about which version of you got to keep existing. I'll add one more thing here, because I think it's the piece that actually determines whether any of the above sticks. None of these 7 steps work as a checklist you complete once. They work as a posture you keep returning to. You will, almost certainly, close the laptop again at some point. You'll feel the pull to call it timing one more time. That's not a sign you failed at this. That's just what being human involves. The difference between the people who eventually open their draft and the people who never do isn't that the first group never hesitates. 3rd, tell one other person. Not everyone. Not social media, necessarily. One person you trust, who will actually ask you about it later. The moment a plan exists outside your own head, it behaves differently. It becomes slightly real. It becomes something you'd feel a bit embarrassed abandoning, and that small, uncomfortable accountability does more heavy lifting than almost any amount of self-motivation. 4th, do the smallest possible version of the first step within 24 hours. Not the whole plan. The smallest fragment of it. If it's a business, that might just be buying the domain name. If it's a conversation, it might just be texting, "Can we talk sometime this week?" Nothing more. The goal isn't progress, exactly. The goal is breaking the seal. Once you've done anything, even something tiny, the decision stops being purely theoretical. It starts being a thing that is already, technically, in motion. 5th, and this is the one people skip, forgive the years you already lost. Elena spent 11 years as a lawyer before the bakery. The man in the waiting room spent decades before he even let himself think about that other life again. Neither of them described those years as wasted, once they'd finally moved. They described them as the version of the story that happened before the version that mattered. You don't need those years to make sense yet. You just need to stop letting them be the reason you wait for a 6th. The opposite of recklessness isn't permanent waiting. It's preparation with an actual deadline attached to it. Elena's 18 months in the hallway weren't wasted time, they were productive, responsible, deliberate. But they also ended. That's the part people skip. They take the responsible first half of Elena's approach, the planning, the saving, the testing, and they quietly forget the second half, which is that at some point, on some specific day, she still had to walk out the door. So let's make this practical, because inspiration without action is just a nicer form of procrastination. First, write the draft down, literally, today. Not in your head, actually written, in a note, a message, an email. The specific plan, the specific fear, the specific, "here's what I'd do if I weren't scared." You don't have to send it. You don't have to act on it this afternoon. But get it out of the vague fog of someday, and into the concrete shape of actual words, because vague intentions are extremely easy to abandon, and specific written plans are surprisingly hard to fully forget. Second, set a deadline that has nothing to do with feeling ready. Ready is a myth we tell ourselves to justify waiting. Elena didn't feel ready to open a bakery. The man in the waiting room, even now, still describes the version of himself who would have moved as, the one who wasn't ready either, he just went anyway. Pick a date. Not when things calm down. An actual date, on an actual calendar, 30 or 60 or 90 days out. Deadlines don't wait for your nervous system to feel comfortable, and that's exactly why they work. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, because I thought it too, for years. This is fine for Elena. This is fine for the man in the waiting room. But my situation is actually different. I have real responsibilities. I can't just act on a feeling. I want to take that seriously instead of brushing past it, because it's not a weak objection. It's usually the truest thing standing between people and their draft. Here's what I'd say to it. Nobody in this video quit anything recklessly. Elena had $11,000 saved and 18 months of weekends spent testing the new life before she ever gave notice. Farid had a fully mapped out backup plan before he switched paths. None of these were leaps off a cliff with no net. They were, in every case, calculated moves made by people who had already done the responsible groundwork, and who then, crucially, still had to face a moment where the groundwork wasn't enough on its own, where they had to act despite still not feeling fully ready. That's the actual distinction I want to draw here, because it matters. This isn't a video telling you to be reckless. It's not, quit your job tomorrow with no plan. It's, stop mistaking the planning phase for a permanent residence. You can be responsible and still be stuck. In fact, responsible people are often the ones who get stuck the longest, because responsibility gives you an endless, legitimate-sounding supply of reasons to wait one more season, one more year, one more right time, that never quite arrives on its own. That phrase stuck with me almost as much as the waiting room line did. The version of me who's allowed. As if permission is a thing that arrives from outside, on its own schedule, rather than something you simply decide to grant yourself on an ordinary Thursday. Here's what's interesting. Farid was 19, standing at the very beginning of his adult life, and he was already running the exact same program as the 70-year-old man in the waiting room and the corporate lawyer with the bakery. Different ages, different stakes, same operating system, waiting for a permission slip that was never going to arrive in the mail, because nobody was mailing it. He was the only person who could sign it. He did eventually switch paths, for what it's worth. Not because he suddenly felt ready, he told me later he didn't, right up until the day he actually did it. He switched because he ran out of patience with his own waiting, which is a slightly different and, I'd argue, far more reliable trigger than confidence ever is. I think that's the real thread connecting all three of these people, Elena, the man in the waiting room, Farid. None of them were waiting for a better plan. Their plans were already good, in every case, well before they acted. They were waiting for a feeling. And the feeling, as far as I can tell from all three stories, never actually shows up on schedule. It shows up afterward, as a side effect of having already moved. I asked him what he'd say to someone standing where he stood at 28. He thought about it for a long moment, long enough that I thought he might not answer at all, and then he said, I'd tell him the fear doesn't go away when you're ready. It goes away when you stop asking it to leave first. That's worth repeating too. We treat courage like a precondition, like something that has to arrive before we can act, the way you'd wait for a green light. But courage doesn't usually work that way. Courage is far more often the thing you feel afterward, looking back at what you just did, wondering how you managed it. In the moment itself, it rarely feels like courage. It just feels like doing the thing anyway, scared, unqualified, unready, and slightly nauseous. Now, you might be thinking this is all a lesson for people in their 50s looking backward. It isn't. Let me tell you about someone on the complete opposite end of this. A few years ago I was mentoring, loosely, informally, mostly over coffee, a 19-year-old named Farid who was deciding whether to drop out of a degree he hated to pursue something else entirely. He wasn't lost, exactly. He was terrified of disappointing his parents, who had sacrificed a lot to send him to that particular program. What struck me about Farid wasn't the decision itself. Plenty of 19-year-olds face some version of that fork. What struck me was that he already had the entire plan mapped out, in detail, in a notes app on his phone, course names, costs, a rough timeline, even a backup plan if the new path didn't work. He'd clearly spent dozens of hours on it. I asked him the obvious question, if the plan is this thorough, what's actually stopping you? He said, I keep waiting to feel like the version of me who's allowed to make this decision. He told me about a version of himself at 28 who wanted to move to another country for a job that scared him. He didn't take it. Reasonable reasons, at the time, his mother was unwell, the timing felt wrong, there'd be other opportunities. He said the strange part isn't that he regretted not going. The strange part is that for the first 15 years afterward, he didn't think about it at all. He built a life. A good one, by most measures. Married, kids, a steady career. The decision seemed to have simply resolved itself, the way unattended things sometimes do, not through action, but through time quietly closing the door on your behalf. And then, in his 50s, it came back. Not as a dramatic regret, but as a specific ache whenever certain things happened, a documentary about that country, an old colleague mentioning it in passing, a smell that reminded him of nothing in particular except a version of himself he never got to meet. Here's what he said that I think is the most important sentence in this entire video: I didn't miss the country. I missed the person I would have become if I'd gone. Sit with that for a second, because it reframes the entire idea of a missed opportunity. It's not really about the external thing, the job, the move, the relationship, the business. It's about the version of you that only exists on the other side of that decision. When you don't act, you're not just avoiding a risk. You're quietly voting against a person you'll never get to meet, a version of yourself with a different set of scars, different confidence, different stories to tell at 50. That's the actual cost of an unsent message, an unopened door, an unsent draft. Not the missed outcome. The missed self. I want to ask you something, and I actually want you to answer it in the comments, not just think about it and scroll past. What's your draft? Not a business, necessarily. It could be a conversation you've been meaning to have, an apology you owe someone, a skill you keep saying you'll learn eventually, a version of your life you've quietly filed under later. Type it below. One sentence. You don't need a plan. You just need to say it out loud, in public, to strangers, because something changes when a thought leaves your head and becomes a sentence someone else can read. Let's go somewhere else for a second. Not a bakery. Not a parking lot. A hospital waiting room. I was there for something unrelated, a relative's minor surgery, nothing dramatic, and I sat across from an older man, maybe 70, who was there for his wife. We started talking the way strangers do in waiting rooms, half out of boredom, half out of needing a distraction from our own thoughts. He told me something I wrote down on my phone the second he said it, because I knew I'd want to remember it exactly. He said, regret doesn't arrive the day you make the wrong choice. It arrives quietly, 30 years later, on an ordinary Tuesday, when you're doing something completely unrelated and it just taps you on the shoulder. I sat with that sentence longer than I probably should have, given that I was supposed to be in that waiting room for someone else's surgery, not my own life crisis. But it rearranged something. Because most of us are braced for regret to arrive loudly, a dramatic moment of realization, a movie-style collapse onto the floor. It almost never works that way. It arrives on a Tuesday. It arrives while you're doing laundry. It taps you on the shoulder for 3 seconds and then lets you get back to your day, and you carry it slightly differently for the rest of the week without fully knowing why. She said almost nobody talks about the hallway. Every success story skips straight from, I was unhappy, to, I made the leap, as if the leap happens the moment the unhappiness becomes clear. It doesn't. There's this long, quiet, uncomfortable stretch in between where you're still showing up to the old life every day, performing competence at something you've already emotionally left, and the only person who knows you're standing in a hallway is you. I think that's actually the part people need to hear most, because it's the part that makes people feel like something is wrong with them. You're not broken if you know what you want and still haven't done it yet. You might just be in the hallway. The hallway is normal. The mistake isn't standing in it, the mistake is mistaking the hallway for a permanent room and unpacking your furniture there. She also told me something practical about how she got through the hallway, and I think it's worth including here even though it jumps ahead of where I said we'd go with the advice. She started, in her words, auditioning the new life on weekends, baking on Saturdays, selling at a small farmer's market, before she ever quit anything. Not as a side hustle she planned to keep forever. As a way of shortening the hallway. Every weekend she spent in that new identity made the eventual leap smaller, because by the time she actually quit, she wasn't stepping into a stranger's life. She was just making her weekend life permanent. That's a detail worth remembering. You don't have to leap from a standstill. You can walk most of the distance before you ever officially decide to go. I asked her the obvious question, wasn't she terrified to leave a stable, high-paying career for something so uncertain? She said something I've never forgotten. She said, I wasn't scared of the bakery failing. I was scared of turning 50 and realizing I'd spent 30 years being excellent at something I never actually chose, I just never stopped doing it. That distinction matters more than people give it credit for. There's a difference between staying because you chose it, and staying because you simply never got around to leaving. The second one feels identical to the first from the outside. Nobody around you can tell the difference. But you can. You always can. You feel it in a specific kind of tired that has nothing to do with how many hours you worked. Elena didn't have a 5-year plan when she quit. She had $11,000 in savings, a recipe for sourdough her grandmother taught her, and, her words, a draft I'd been sitting on for way too long. She used that exact phrase. A draft. She didn't mean it literally the way I did. She meant it the same way most of us mean it, an idea we wrote down, in one form or another, and then filed away under later. I want to give you one more piece of Elena's story, because it matters more than the bakery itself. She told me the hardest part wasn't quitting her job. It was the 18 months before she quit, when she already knew, with total certainty, that she was going to leave, but hadn't yet. She called that period the hallway. Not the old room, not the new room. The hallway in between, where you already know which door you're walking toward, but your feet haven't caught up to your certainty yet. I'll tell you what the draft actually said in a few minutes, word for word, because I still have it. But first I need to tell you about the day I finally opened it again, because that day taught me something about waiting that I think you need to hear before the reveal means anything. Last month, I was cleaning out old notes on my laptop, the digital equivalent of clearing out a closet, and I found it. The draft. Still sitting there, 6 years old, time-stamped from a parking lot on a Tuesday evening. My first instinct was to just delete it. Move on. It felt like looking at an old photo of someone slightly embarrassing. But I opened it instead. And reading my own words from 6 years ago felt like reading a letter from someone I used to know very well and had slowly lost touch with. The person who wrote that draft was scared, yes, but he was also completely, painfully clear about what he wanted. There was no confusion in that draft. Zero. The confusion came later, after I didn't act. Confusion is what fills the space where action was supposed to go. That's something worth repeating. Confusion is not usually the reason we don't act. Confusion is usually the result of not acting. We tell ourselves, I'm still figuring it out, as if clarity is a prerequisite for movement, when for most of us, it's the other way around. Clarity is what movement produces. You don't think your way into certainty and then act. You act, and certainty catches up to you a few steps later, slightly out of breath. I want to tell you about someone I met a few years after writing that draft, a woman named Elena, who ran a small bakery 2 blocks from an apartment I used to live in. I used to stop in most mornings, and over time we got to talking. She told me she'd been a corporate lawyer for 11 years before she opened that bakery.